Our speaker this morning is Phil Crawford. I met Phil about a year and a half ago up at the San Francisco Humanist group, Bay Area Humanists. And I heard this talk a couple months ago, and I asked him if he would do it for us down here, and he agreed. I think it's a really interesting talk for those who maybe are looking elsewhere and not really aware of this issue. There's a lot of stuff going on with the non-binary gender. We aren't just male and female anymore. There's so much more variation. A lot of people are talking about it, and a lot of people are living it. Some of that is pretty difficult. Some of that is unusual. His story I found very interesting, especially, I'll just say this as a bit of this is what grabbed me the most, is that he had to work through his own grief as a father around this issue, and how that came about was surprising to me. So I hope we will enjoy this talk, and welcome Phil Crawford. Thanks.
Hi. So I want to say, first of all, this won't be exactly the same talk that I gave before, because now I've got multimedia. Woo! Also, I've given a lot of thought. That opportunity to speak, I'm kind of responding a little bit to what happened at that event, which was not the most successful thing that I might have hoped for. So we're talking about parenting a non-binary human. I'm tricking you all. That's not really what this is about. I'm going to talk about a different view of gender. And then in the Q&A and whatnot, we can talk about my experiences as a parent. So my name is Phil Crawford, and I'm on the board of the San Francisco chapter of PFLAG, Parents, Friends, and Family, Go PFLAG. It's a support group for parents and families and friends of people who have gay folks or transgender folks in their lives. I went to PFLAG when my kid came out, and I had a lot of questions, wasn't sure what was going on. Like Laura mentioned, there was a process there. We can talk about the coming out story. It's pretty good as a parent. I stayed with PFLAG because of the community there. There's some great folks, and it's brought a lot of meaning and enjoyment to my life, and now I'm trying to give back a little bit as a member of the board. I'm also a board member with your sister organization, if I can say that, much younger sibling, the Bay Area Humanists, and we hope someday to build up to what you have, something similar to what you have here. So, my kid is Lux. I guess the most important thing to say is that this is basically the greatest human being that's ever existed. And when Lux was born, the doctor said, "It's a girl." And we didn't know that the doctor was wrong. So, so here's where it gets interesting and complicated. As a result of Lux coming out as gender neutral, I've learned this whole idea, been exposed to this whole idea, that gender is much more complicated for a lot of people than just a male and female binary. So I went over all this presentation with Lux, and I have to say, first of all, you need to understand that what I'm talking about today is my own interpretation, my own understanding, and it's going to reflect my journey of learning about this. There were some parts of this that Lux really didn't agree with, and I'm sure that there's parts that a lot of trans or non-binary folks would disagree with. So this is my reflection, and don't take this as gospel. So this is a diagram that kind of gives you an idea of how complicated gender can be for some people. So there's male and female, but then there's also genderqueer, kind of opposite that. But if you look, there's a lot of other spaces in here too, including genderless, pangender, and androgen and neutrois. All of these are very significant to the people that use these labels as identifiers for their own self. The main thing that, as a non-trans person, we'll get into vocabulary a little bit, a cis person, the main thing is that it's up to that individual to choose a label for themselves that has meaning for them and their identity. It's our responsibility to respect them and go along with that. So if I was going to, Lux, by the way, hates this chart, but if I was going to pick a spot for Lux, it would be somewhere around here. So on the feminine side of genderqueer, but not particularly close to female. So let's talk about some of the words that are going to be useful to understand this fascinating and complicated topic. The first thing you need to understand is that we have a word for trans folk, and they have a word for us. Their word is cis. Cis and trans come from biochemistry. When you think about a fat, can either be a trans fat or a cis fat. So basically trans means it's change. It literally means crossing over, and cis means essentially staying the same. So right now we've already run into a problem with words, because trans has the idea of switching from one extreme to another. And yet what we're talking about today is people who aren't either extreme. So vocabulary is still catching up, like most people, like me. Transition is, I mean, it's a very obvious concept. So you start with one thing and then you become something else. But in fact, a trans person would tell you that that's not what this means at all. So a trans man, for example, has always been a man. There was never a time in their life when they were female. So when they're talking about transition, what they're talking about is a social transition, where they stopped wearing dresses and started wearing pants, or more likely kept wearing pants but cut their hair short, or whatever. Whatever the distinction is, they have asked people to refer to them by their correct pronoun. In the case of a trans woman, that would be she, or a trans man, it would be he. That's the transition that this word refers to. So there's some people who are categorized as intersex. And basically this is a biological term. And it's saying that the primary sexual characteristics of the individual do not indicate them to be male or female. This is a lot more common than people think. And one of the reasons it's more common is that in the past, when a baby was born with indeterminate genitalia, the first thing the doctor would do is do surgery on it and try to make it either male or female, and then the kid would be raised as either a woman or a man. The intersex community opposes this and are trying to find ways to either create a third category at birth, which Germany tried with not entire success, but basically to create more awareness of the fact that this is a legitimate place, that that's how these people were born, and that's a part of their identity and who they can be. Some intersex people don't find out that they were intersex until they, like a woman would go to the doctor and say, I'm not having my period. They say, well, you don't have a uterus. And that's how they would find out. This is an ugly word, transphobia. Obviously, it's very similar to homophobia, and the idea is just a sense of discomfort around the idea or around the individuals who are trans. It can be a very subtle thing, and it's a very common thing. I think all of us, to some degree, have some amount of discomfort around things that we're not familiar with and not comfortable with. And I have to say to myself that it's something that I've struggled with and try to overcome, along with my homophobia, all that. By being aware of it, I try to fight against it. One of the ways that we see transphobia illustrated is through the resistance of preferred pronouns. My kids' pronouns are they and theirs. And a lot of people will say, but it's not grammatically correct to use they, referring to a singular person. Let's just set that aside and not go there. Okay, that's an argument I'm tired of having. That's my kid's pronoun. That's how they want to be called. And we can argue about it, and I can say, well, Shakespeare used it. You actually use it all the time when the person's not identified. It's pointless. You either accept it or you don't. Intersectionality is a concept coming out of social science, is particularly feminism. It's the idea that in our society there's a structure of privilege, and that it is a complex structure of privilege, and that, for example, being a male, I have privilege. Being white, I have privilege. Being cis, I have privilege. And all these things are not simply additive, but multiplicative, so that a female white cis person has a whole different range of privilege than I do. A black gay woman has a different life situation than I do. This is particularly complicated when we're talking about trans. Because of the privilege of men, a trans woman is actually in a position of I don't know exactly how to say this. So a trans woman is moving away from masculine ideal. And that means there's more discomfort in regards to a trans woman. A trans man is moving from female to masculine ideal, and so has more privilege. So it's very complicated when you're talking about trans and you bring in the concept of intersectionality, because every single person is going to have a different relationship to this structure of privilege. And I'm not an expert on feminism, and it's a very broad, gender studies is a huge field, and I'm just skimming along the top. Like I said, this is my understanding. When we think about vocabulary, it's important to keep in mind that there are words that we shouldn't use, as well as words that we need to understand. The T word ends with a Y, and it's worse than the N word. It means, for a trans woman, it means threat. It means their safety is at risk. And if you want to alienate someone really quickly, that's a good way to do it. Okay. So regarding gender, our conventional view of gender is biological based. There are people that have an XX chromosome and people that have XY chromosome. But as we've already mentioned with intersex folks, that's not necessarily true for everyone. So we have this prejudice that everyone's either male or female, and that's based on biology, but we know that biology itself is not necessarily accurate, or not absolute. So this is a quote from a blog post that a trans woman, I'll read the important points here. Part of a conversation that a trans woman was having with a man who was arguing in favor of biological determinism. This is the idea that what your genes say you are is who you are. And her point was that the genes actually code for proteins like hormones, and that the hormones react with other parts of the body to determine the phenotype of the individual. But there's several different conditions that can lead to intersex, where for various reasons like hyperplasia, androgen insensitivity syndrome, these hormones are produced, but the body doesn't read them correctly. And basically her point was that the biological classifications did not decide who I am as a person or how I should identify. The development of the brain is also influenced by hormones on a fundamental level, causing people like me to have an incongruence between our basic brain sex and how the rest of our body develops. So parts of our brain are also developed with biological gender, and that can be different than how the body develops. That's basically what it's saying. Okay, so if we set aside biological determinism, then we need a new concept of what gender means. So this is the basic outline is often referred to as Trans 101. And if you're interested in this topic, there's a lot of different versions of Trans 101 on the internet, and it's a great topic to follow up with if you're interested in more about it. So there's a phrase that goes along with this, and it's a phrase that my kid hates, and it's probably not entirely accurate, but I want to remind you that this is a mirror of the learning process that I've gone through. and how my understanding of this has changed. So this is an important moment for me in my learning. Trans means there's a difference between the sex in your head and the sex between your legs. And I didn't say that quite right, but you get the idea. So this is a basic diagram of the spectrum of gender. So at the top we've got biological sex with male at one end and female at the other, and intersex in the middle. We've got gender identity, which is a psychological sense of self, with a man at one end extreme, woman at the other, and genderqueer or bigender, which is a confusing word because it looks like it says big ender, in the middle. And then gender expression, which is how we appear to other people, masculine, feminine, and androgynous. And then sexual orientation, attracted to women, attracted to men, and bisexual or asexual. So one of the things you see right there is, wait, how did sexual orientation get on this list? It's because in our society, if we see a feminine looking man, we often assume that they're gay. If we see a masculine looking woman, we often assume that they're a lesbian. That's not true, but that's an assumption that we have as a part of gender expression. So this is just a real simple idea. It's a kind of an introduction to the trans and the gender spectrum. But I think we can, in my learning, my experience, we can go a little beyond that. So this is very, very simple perspective. So my quest for information took me into the topic of gender studies, which comes out of feminist tradition. And I ran into the work of Sandra Lipsitz-Bim, and she talks about the lenses of gender. And the idea of lenses of gender is that as a society, we construct an idea of what gender is. Bim has three lenses, three ways of looking at gender, and I think that as a touchstone, it's a very good way of having a basic understanding of what gender means in our society, certainly from a feminist perspective. So androcentrism is the idea not just that men are the center of the culture, but that basically men are the culture, and that women are kind of a derivative of men. Women are other. Gender polarization is that there's this gap between men and women. And there's not just a gap, but that we can organize our society along this principal division. And biological essentialism is biological determinism, the idea that we talked in the first case, that there's XX and XY people and that's all there is. And it forms a justification for the two other lenses. So the idea of gender that I'd like to leave you with, and where my understanding of it now, is that it's an interaction between the norms and ideals of our society of what gender means and the personal identity of the individual. And the key is that there can be conflict between these two concepts, between these two entities, and that it's something that we all experience. You know, on the playground in junior high, the most common taunts for a boy are that they don't match the masculine ideal. And it's something that everyone would struggle with. You know your place, be a man, grow a pair. Those are that's the most common insults. So we all experience a certain conflict and distance between these two. And it's especially pronounced, obviously, for a trans person. So, any questions?
Do you want to go to Q&A now, or do you want to just take some questions and then go back?
Let's go ahead and go to questions. That's all I got.
Oh, okay. All right.
I don't know if I missed something, but I don't understand the T word that people hate. Can you...
Tranny.
Pardon?
Tranny.
Trammy?
T-R-A-N-N-Y.
Oh, tranny. I wonder, what does that mean?
It means, it's short for transsexual.
Okay.
Or cross-dressers, cross-dressing men in particular, might be called that name.
And it's used derogatorily.
It's a pejorative. And
I didn't mean to sound ignorant or anything. I just didn't understand.
yeah, no, I'm sorry. I should have spelled that out a little clearer. It's just that as cis people with no contact in the trans community, we may not understand that this is a very scary word, and it's taken as a very dire insult.
Do you know what the incidence of intersex is numerically? I mean, how many in births?
It's surprisingly common, a couple of percent. As I say, in the past it was hidden from sight, and individuals may not have been aware of it until they became adults.
Can you give, if it's possible, or whatever you can you give me an idea of what you went through when you found out the truth of your daughter's sexuality?
So, yeah. So this is the famous coming out story. So the greatest person in the world, who I've already mentioned, and you saw their photo, was always kind of a tomboy, we might say. So always liked to dress in boys' clothes and short hair, and not particularly boys' clothes, but definitely not interested in feminine clothes at all. Didn't like dresses. And was always like to watch Xena, the barbarian princess. That was like their hero, always. And so when they were 13, they started to have some trouble in school. They started to have a lot of stomach aches and not want to go to school. And, well, it was before that, but that's when it started to get worse. So at one point, the kid came up to us and said, "So, I think I'm homosexual." And the story that we told after that was, we were like, "Oh, well, that's fine, no problem." But 13. But in fact, when we went back and reviewed it, and particularly when they told us how they perceived it, the experience that we had after we got over the shock was a sense of grief. And the grief was over who we thought our kid was going to grow up to be, and the life that we had kind of planned out for them, you know, that here was a whole path laid out, and they were abandoning it, and in a sense rejecting us. You know, they wanted to be something different than what we are their parents. And so I like to think that we got over that pretty quickly, but that was part of the reason we started to attend PFLAG meetings, was to try and get some of the questions answered and try to figure out that situation a little bit better. So a couple of years went by, we went on to high school. High school was even worse in some ways than junior high. They had panic attacks. There were days when they couldn't attend class. And finally, around the age of 17, they said, "Please stop using the female pronoun. I'm not a woman. I want you to refer to me as they." They changed their name. Before that, they had been Lucy. And they said, "From now on, my name is Lux," which is pretty close, so that wasn't too hard. And this was somewhat less of a shock to us, because that's kind of how they had always presented, you know, as not super feminine. So getting used to the new pronoun was very hard. Getting used to the name was hard. I still screw that up all the time. But they know that we want to get it right and that we're trying to get it right, and so they're pretty forgiving. I've run into some trans folks that are somewhat less forgiving on that nature and can be real assholes about it, but my kid's pretty forgiving, fortunately. That's a great question, by the way. Thanks for the setup.
Hello. I don't actually have a question, it's more of a comment. About 20 years ago, one of my pretty close friends told me that her husband was going to have a gender change. And I didn't know him terribly well. I know her very well, but I didn't know him all that well. But the whole process to me was really amazing from a couple of points of view, one of which was that when I knew him as a man, I thought of him as a pretty aggressive man. I mean, he came across as male, just male. And so the idea that he thought of himself as female, that was pretty surprising. And then as he went through this change, and it's a long, laborious change. They have surgeries, he had surgery on his jaw, he had electrolysis all over his body. I mean, besides the genital changes, I mean, it's an ongoing several-year process, and hormones and all of this kind of stuff. And then, in the end, he came across as kind of the most unfeminine woman. And I have to say that I've never really been able to understand why he would go to all of this work and trouble and everything, you know, and it just seemed like he wasn't very feminine. So that's just a comment. It's not really a question, but the whole thing has just been puzzling to me over 20 years.
Well, there's a couple of different ideas that are going on there. So in reverse order, the idea of passing is very problematic for a lot of trans folks. So passing is really something that our society finds very preferable, because we like women to look like women and men to look like men. Passing is not necessarily the goal of trans individuals. They're trying to conform their body to their identity. And it may be that a trans woman is very beautiful by our standards. It may be that she's not. But their goal is to reduce the conflict between the cultural ideal and their individual identity. And so in that sense, your friend may have been very successful in the transition. So another idea, when we're talking about trans people, in the past, the idea of trans was there was no non-binary. So if you were raised as a boy, but you didn't feel like you were a boy, the only option was to become a woman. And medically, that's recognized. Insurance recognizes that, to the extent that insurance will cover procedures. So there has to be this distinct going from this transition from one to another. When people learn that there might be other alternatives, and a lot of people will pause midway in their transition. They say, "That's far enough. I'm good." But it's not something that's easy to talk to your doctor. "Oh, I don't feel like a man." "Or are you a woman?" "Well, no, not really a woman either." Meh. So it's just now starting to become a part of a concept in the medical community that people can be not either a man or a woman, but something either in between or other. In the case, genderqueer would be other, gender neutral would be in between, or non-gender would be neither. And let's see, another idea would be that people who start making the physical transition at a younger age will tend to do better. When we're talking about the change when you're a teenager. If you start before puberty, it's much easier. And so one of the things they do for kids now that are trans is give them pituitary blockers, which delay the onset of puberty so that they can have more of an adult size before they go through this, and then the hormones that they're receiving can guide them in the direction that matches closer to their identity. And that way you avoid some of the facial changes and the voice, that kind of thing.
Different people find different things offensive, you know, and as you probably know, running into that. But to me, the concept of white privilege and male privilege is something I find personally offensive. And the reason I do, it's not that the discrimination doesn't exist, but there's a difference between discrimination and privilege. And if we stop discrimination, then we all come up to the same level, but privilege basically sort of implies that certain people are of an elevated status rather than a lower status, you know, and everybody in different situations is discriminated against in certain circumstances. You know, if you're male, you usually don't do as well in divorce court when it comes to property, you know, in marriages with no children, for instance. And it's, you know, so I don't call that female privilege when that happens. I call it discrimination against men in that certain circumstance. And, you know, and you know, when people become more enlightened about things, then everybody comes up to the same level. But, you know, I just find it, you know, that when people say, you know, male privilege and white privilege and
Well,
just
I know
basically
men's
is
rights
just
is a
dead
big
wrong
topic.
and offensive to me.
Men's rights is a growing movement that a lot of people feel, but I think one thing that's very important to understand is that feminism fights for everyone. The patriarchy hurts us all. And
I agree with that, you know. I mean, I agree that there's lots of discrimination against women. There's lots of discrimination against black people in particular.
So what's the opposite of discrimination?
Non-discrimination. Privilege is not the opposite of discrimination. You got to look at it as three levels. There's normal, there's up, and there's down. And what we have is, in this country is normal and down. But there's, you know, no up. You know, in other countries, if you're...
I politely disagree.
Yeah, but, you know, anyhow, I find it offensive because
That's called fragility,
wrong.
because you're in a position of privilege.
We can do that more at the speaker's table after this talk, if you like.
My understanding of intersectionality is that it's bigger than gender related. It's racial, it's ethnicity,
Yes.
it's ability, it's class,
Yes.
it's skin color, complexion, it's heritage. So there's a hierarchy of privileges based on all of these.
I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that.
Terms,
That's
yeah.
absolutely precisely what that means.
One thing I do in my class for prospective high school teachers who have to take a class to unlearn their biases and racism and privilege and so on is I have an activity called Power Shuffle. And one of you walk across the room if you identify as a male or a man, and you see who's with you and you see who's not. That's just one of about 25 things. Skin color, if non-white, if you're upper middle class, if you're working class, if your parents never went to college, if there are all these characteristics of people on the target or downside of power. And always, my students who are college graduates walk across when they define all of them as men, cis men, they think, but there are some people who are transgender in there, there's some people bisexual and so on, but that distinction is only now becoming clear to them. And when I have two speakers actually from the Outlet, I don't know if you're familiar with that group, but they're based here in Palo Alto and in Mountain View. They come into my class and my students say, two men are here to talk about by GLBT issues. These two men are really transgender people, both of them. One a woman who's become a man and looks very male, and the other a woman who's on the journey to becoming a man. So for those who don't think privilege is around, there's a wonderful video or YouTube video called The Ideology of Whiteness by Tim Weiss.
Thank you.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for coming and sharing your story. I just wanted to let you know that I had done a little research on the question that we talked about last time about the Filipino language. Is anyone in here Filipino? They have the same word for he and she. It's one word. It would be interesting to, there are other languages in the world similar. It would be interesting to actually look at some data on how people's sense of identity changes with the language, with the culture. It would be interesting to see it for one country and another and just compare that. Just putting that out there.
Yes, hi, I'm Jane, and this is not a question. I am the parent of a male to female transsexual who did their final changing about 10 years ago. And my daughter asked at work, she went there to say that if they didn't let her change, she was going to quit. She works for a large electronics company. She's an engineer. And they found somebody to help her there. And he told her that she would be the 8th person he has helped to transition in 15 years. And so things went really smoothly. She got her time off of work, even got some disability pay during the couple months off for surgery. And she's been with them ever since. And the people there have, at least in the teams that she knows, have all had training on, how to treat transsexual people, so they know how to say the right thing. And this Silicon Valley has a lot of this going on. It's not in the newspaper. Also, Stanford University, there have been several people over there who were allowed to change.
Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Phil. It's a very informative presentation. I had a couple of questions. First, given your spectrum up there, I'm just wondering, the desire to have children, has there been any association between some of the categories up there? Anybody studied that or looked into that? And not necessarily physically have children, but to raise children. Is there any?
I'm not aware of any actual empirical work done on that. My experiences would suggest, of the small statistical universe that I'm exposed to, of half a dozen or so trans folk, is that that's not a big issue. That's not a huge concern of theirs.
Yeah, just curious.
They're young people mostly that I know. So.
And the second one, I would also have something to do with our group here, and being raised in a religious family would make it seem like making it more difficult, to come out or to express their issue. And is there any data on how many people are within, considering that most of the majority of our nation considers themselves to be religious, and people are being raised in those families, and the impact of being in a religious environment as another hurdle to their process?
I know that there has been work done on that subject, that it's not terribly interesting to me, so I haven't followed up on that, but I can say in my own household that my wife was a devout Catholic. I've been an atheist most of my life, And when our kid first came out, my wife very quickly ran into problems with the church. We were first tolerant and then accepting of our kid, and my wife's left the church since then, which has caused problems between her and her mother. That's another story.
Dana St. George. Hi, this is such an interesting subject, and it has been treated, in literature. I'm thinking of Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah.
And when I first read one of those books, I was like amazed. I thought, whoa, really interesting. So I think that, I was thinking, well, what does it offer society, and what does it mean that society is having this happen? And I'm wondering if it has something to do with overpopulation. I'm just looking at it from the biological standpoint, kind of. And I think what it offers is, besides like an upward spiral of personal freedom, escaping from a biological destiny that's given to us at birth, supposedly, which is, the kind of way I understood it when I was a kid. You're born this or that and the other thing, and that's it. But, nowadays, we have more possibility. And so it does offer, it's kind of functional in that way. Because if lots of people don't want to be chained to a certain biological destiny, they can choose another lifestyle and not be criticized for it, or, so that's good. And then the problem I see with it, though, is that it is expensive. And so that it's very costly to the society to have, like the long surgeries and changes and so on. And so that might be a factor that could be a problem. But apparently, a lot of people are still being successful at it. But I think if you read any of Ursula Le Guin's books, you can run into all kinds of interesting possibilities for gender.
Yeah.
I'm going to just jump in here for a second, because you just made me think about this. What if the rest of society really didn't care? What if the rest, those of us who weren't affected this way, it didn't really matter. These people weren't oppressed. I don't know too many of them, and I've never actually had the chance to ask them this question. I wonder what you think, given the ones you know. Would they have gone through this expensive process if society was different?
I would have to say yes, and I'll tell you that people will put up with personal safety, risk to their personal safety, great inconvenience and expense in order to conform to their identity in opposition to their biological self. Or that's problematic, but in order, their assigned gender.
But what if we didn't assign so hard? What if we didn't really even assign? What at some point, like 300 years from now, where it's just known that, when kids are born, they could be anything. And so we just kind of let it happen, whatever it is. And there's nothing they have to hide from. There's nothing they have to fight.
That's a great question.
Hi, I would just love to hear you explain this. I would think queer would be the no word, and you have that up all over there, and why is it reversed, gender queer, female, gender queer? I don't know why you're reversing those. Or what do these terms mean?
Okay.
And are the people...
So if you notice in the background, there's a color spectrum.
Yeah.
And we all know the primary colors are blue, red, and yellow. This particular diagram, and there are other ways to diagram this. This isn't the only way, and my kid hates this one, but I like it because it's pretty. This presents 3 primary gender identities, and then secondary gender identities, and then different ways that you could be outside of those 3 primary or the secondary. So,
can you define the terms?
So male, female. Genderqueer is something other than male or female. Androgen is a combination of male and female. Genderqueer male, somewhere between this identity, queer, whatever it is, genderqueer, and male, and then this one between female and this alternate third identity. Oops.
Also, queer is a political term. It's been gathered from the fights in New York City when they tried to shut down a bar that was Stonewall.
It's genderqueer has been adopted as a generic term for people that do not, that are not on the extremes of the gender spectrum. So it's a generic term. In this diagram, though, genderqueer refers to a specific third position. So it's not a linear spectrum. It's something in a different, it's off of that spectrum. It's different.
How about pangender and neurosis?
Pangender means that you identify as all of us. It's like there's not one single spot, but maybe another word is gender fluid. The idea that, what am I going to wear pants or a dress this morning when I get up? I'll wait and see. And then genderless means none of that applies to me. It just has nothing to do with my identity or who I am. Androgyny is a mix of male and female.
Where they have both sexual organs.
This is gender identity. It doesn't really refer to intersex. It's just a sense of personal identity.
Beginning this year, De Anza College opened a third door bathrooms on its campus. So I was wondering, part A, is that effective to have just one extra bathroom, or because of all these combinations and permutations, do we need more bathroom doors? And then part B is, did your children, do you think if they had the third bathroom door for their high school, would they have encountered less emotional distress that way?
That's a good question. When I talk to my kid and I ask them, are you getting a hard time from the other students? And they would say, no, that's not it. So, I think it was just a feeling of, one, not having a specific place where they could exist, that matched who they were, not having a seat at the table. And two, definitely being pushed into an identity that they didn't recognize as their own. So if you met my kid and you didn't know anything else, you would assume that they were female. You would assume, part of the lens, the idea of what it means to be female in our society, you would assume that all that applies to them, and you would respond to them through that lens. And that's a very uncomfortable thing for them because that's not who they see themselves as.
Hi, Phil.
Hey, Dana.
So I actually want to address a couple of the things that have been said, and I think one is this whole idea of genderqueer, and it really is, Phil kind of mentioned it, but to make it incredibly clear the distinction between gender and sexuality, because this is totally a discussion on gender and not who's having sex with whom. And so when we say genderqueer, we're not saying queer as in a queer person, as in gay bashing and all of that, right? Because I have many friends who now do identify as genderqueer, feeling themselves somewhere on the spectrum, and many friends who are gender fluid, and more friends who are transgendered than I ever even realized originally. So, mainly because I'm a big girl. So, I've also realized many people assumed I was. But the T word, tranny, and things like the third bathroom and all of that, to me, the primary reason it is important that we care about that is that transgendered people, trans asterisk people, are not really safe in many areas of this society. And Silicon Valley, there are some companies that have been supportive of people going through transition. There have been others that have harassed people right out of there, especially small companies. Under Obamacare, gender reassignment surgery is covered, but only if a company is of a certain size. And I have a friend who pretty much got forced out of her business and has been fighting to stay and fought them to cover gender reassignment surgery and is now on disability because of psychological issues. She tried to kill herself. So, I take that stuff very personally. But trans people of color, and in particular trans women of color, die at a ridiculously high rate from murder in this country. There's a Trans Day of Remembrance every year, at which they read off the names of the people who have been murdered in the year, and it goes on for hours. So it is incredibly important to look at this as a community that needs help and understanding, and this thought that gender really isn't binary, and why should we give a damn what somebody's gender is? Shouldn't we just support them to feel comfortable in who they are? The bathrooms are being put in to give a safe space, because there are genderqueer individuals, there are trans individuals who have been raped in schools. The unfortunate thing for trans men is that they're very, very likely to get raped or assaulted, because when people realize that you have a trans man with female genitalia, then many men get upset and they're very, very likely to be sexually assaulted. So to me, that's what a lot of this is about, and getting this knowledge out, really to keep a community safe.
And it's a part of our cis-normative culture that we are privileged to overlook the privilege of being safe. That I can feel very comfortable walking down basically any street, and because I'm a man and because I look like a man, people read me as a man, it's very unlikely that anyone would bother me. I have a nibbling. Nibbling is a word that means the child of a sibling. I have a nibbling who is genderqueer and has had frequent assaults walking down a street because they have an off-shift job. They've been threatened by a gun, they've been beat up just because of their non-masculine appearance.
Hi, I really appreciated the talk, and I just wanted to respond to a couple of the comments that were being made. Also a huge Ursula Le Guin fan, and I think someone asked the question about why, biologically speaking, I think there's a lot of social reasons why we're encountering a change in society, and I think to some extent we've always had a non-gender binary system, really. And also, there's a great book called The Riddle of Gender that talks about the ways that environmental factors might play into, in utero, the formation of gender identity, and the ways that synthetic estrogens and testosterone mimicking chemicals affect a baby's growth. So one of the things that they talk about in there is there was this drug called DES that was given quite systematically to pregnant women for decades, and they only found out that it was a problem when the daughters of these women developed this rare form of cancer, right? But then they went back and they looked at the sons, or really the XY children of these women, and found out that a huge number of them were now trans women. So the hypothesis there is that this synthetic estrogen affected the baby in utero and really changed the developmental process from the way it might have been otherwise. So I think that's a really interesting hypothesis. And then the other thing I wanted to respond to is whether trans people want to have children. There's a great trans parenting support group in San Francisco that if anyone's interested in learning more, they can join that. And also I wanted to mention that it is very much of concern to the community. For example, one of the rights that people are fighting for is the ability to have your new gender recognized even if you haven't had so-called sex reassignment surgery, because that surgery removes your ability to reproduce. So if you want to have children and you want to have your internal gender recognized, often those things are in conflict. It's also a problem in the gay and lesbian community. We have a friend who was recently diagnosed with cancer. She had to get chemotherapy, and this was going to destroy her egg supply. And we found out during that process that gay and lesbian and trans people are routinely not asked whether they plan to reproduce. So if a heterosexual couple goes in and they're of reproductive age and they're diagnosed with cancer and they're going to have chemotherapy, they're given all these options for, here's how you freeze your sperm, here's how you freeze your eggs in case you want to have children later. And that's routinely not offered to people who are perceived as genderqueer or queer. So, thank you.
I think another factor in the growing visibility of non-binary folk is the internet. They're relatively isolated and relatively scattered geographically, and the internet, like Tumblr in particular, allow them to communicate with each other and exchange ideas and sort of build a common mythos, a common knowledge base, and certainly develop community and language.
Another element of who you are is that you are large. You're saying you feel safe, right. You're white, you're male, you're also large.
Yep.
And I wonder if society were less extreme about what they expect of each gender, whether it would be maybe less often felt that one had to change. It seems like there are a lot of androgynous women around that are just normal women the way they are these days. It's just different than the way they used to be in Victorian times. And
it kind of goes to Laura's question. That goes to Laura's question about what would it be like for these folks if society was different.
The thing about the bathrooms, it seems as though they're going more toward individual stalls, like rather than labeling them. I'm not sure I like the idea of when they have one that's open for all sexes. I think that's a step backward. But individual stalls rather than a big area that's one sex. And one other thing, I would like to have heard more about, individual experiences, anecdotal evidence. And I did wonder about the children. Have you any idea, did your daughter, or your intend to, your kid, ever have any interest in having children, or was that just not a thing for, never?
No, but they're 20 years old. They're 20 years old.
Yeah.
And that's just not a
That
not
could
an issue.
change, I suppose. Yeah.
Who knows?
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, and I certainly learned a lot of confusing things that I don't know if I'll remember all that.
Welcome to my world.
I'm wondering about what's the situation in terms of politics and laws and so on. We have the problem now about gay marriage, and there's this ongoing problem about discriminating against people who just want to live their life their own way. So is anything going on in state legislatures or Congress or anything like that?
So I actually am an advisor to a project trying to change the way gender is recognized on official documents in the state of California. It's a project that's just in its infancy, but we're looking at lobbying part of it depends on how the software works at the DMV and elsewhere to exactly what the best solution to that would be, but to create at least one more option for gender on driver's licenses and other official documents. There's a lot of, this is, an anecdote about this would be I believe it was Pittsburgh, there's a photo ID required for using public transit. And everyone has to have their own pass, and it's illegal to use someone else's. So there were instances where people who had gone through transition were using a pass with their old photograph and then were kicked off the bus because it looked like they were using somebody else's ID. Different picture, different name. This isn't you. You can't ride the bus. So we'll see how that goes. Oh, I had a story about bathrooms. So every year in the East Bay is an event called Gender Spectrum, and it's actually a huge convention where parents and healthcare providers and other providers come in to talk about transgender issues. And it's mostly targeted at parents of younger kids or the caregivers for those folks. Well, they opened up the bathrooms they made all the bathrooms uni. So I had the experience of standing in line with a bunch of women to go into the bathroom, and it was profoundly uncomfortable, and everyone was staring at me, and I managed to get the business done and get out of there as quick as I could. No urinal, so I don't know what the bother was.
Yeah, I didn't know what you mean on that one. I had a friend who came from another state, and I explained to her that in California, this means people wearing pants, and this one is people wearing dresses. I have a brother who's gay, and we come from a family that was fairly dysfunctional, but not religious. So we were basically Jewish atheists. So we didn't have any religious problems with homosexuals, other than there was a part of it that just seemed a little unusual, but about the concept, since we were raised with the concept of binary gender. But we got over it pretty quickly, and my brother's always been that way. We explain now that when I was young, when my mother was pregnant with him, that I wanted a brother, my sister wanted a sister, so we compromised. And but anyhow, he grew up because there really wasn't any sense of really real discrimination in the family. He grew up normal for what he is, and he brings his gay friends to Thanksgiving dinner, and we all get along with his friends, and they're wonderful people, and so it does make a big difference if we ever get to the kind of society where we just don't care what gender anybody else is, where it just absolutely does not matter, does seem to make a big difference, and I just want to get...
It's never happened in history, but it would be awesome if it did.
Well, certain places it has. It hasn't worked on a society level, no, but, in individual families, I think there's some, at least in my case, one individual family where, it really didn't matter, and everybody became whatever they wanted to be, and you're normal when you're in that situation.
I don't like gays, but he's okay.
So we have probably one more minute. I'm going to ask you, of the talk that you just gave, are there any particular parts of it that Lux would really, that you want to talk about that she thinks should have been presented a different way? I'm just curious if there's something, one or two things you might want to...
Gender is in your head, sex is in your pants. They really don't like that. But for me, it was an important moment in my learning about what transgender means and is.
Is that the only point that they had trouble with?
Well, they didn't like this diagram, but mostly because they don't feel that that represents their position very well. And there's other ways, like I've seen L diagrams, all kinds of stuff. So this is just one way of looking at it that I liked because it's a good graphic.
I just wanted to comment. I've read some articles recently, and one of the comments he made was that children are so good at picking up categories and expectations from other people that all the studies about the gender differences, they're all questionable. There's no category, there's no trait that is really innately feminine or masculine. I was wondering how you feel about that.
Well, yeah, and if you pair words, strong, weak, dominant, submissive, and then you ask people to say which of these words is masculine, which is these feminine, you'll actually find a high degree of agreement across cultures. So there are some, if you make it very simple, and this is the only choice you have, then people can agree on what gender means. But the issue I think you're referring to is true of all social science. We're talking about finding out about an intelligent person that responds to their environment and knows that you're trying to find out about stuff from them. So it's tricky. There's also, any graph, any trait that you break down and graph you'd see a bimodal distribution between men. Anything that's a distinct difference that we assume is different, you'll see a bimodal distribution. You'll always see much more variation within a gender than between the genders. So height, we assume men are taller than women, but there's a lot more range of height between women or between men than there is between the two. The average is closer than the range. Does that make sense? I may not be explaining that very well.
Okay, so this is our last question. If you have more questions after this, join Phil at the speaker table for lunch.
Actually, this is another comment like mine before, and it pertains to the same person. He, now she, has made the transition very successfully, is successful in her field. She's remarried.
It's not he, now a she. It was always a she.
Okay.
And she used to be viewed as a male.
Okay. Okay, so she is remarried. You know the person that continues to have the problem? Their son. He's afraid to get married. He's afraid to have children. It's been very, very traumatic. Now, I'm going back maybe 5 years, but I'm saying over a period of 15 years, that adjustment was very, very difficult for their son.
Yes. Okay, that was our last question. Let's continue the conversation at the speaker table. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.